But the key point really is that even at the time, while he was pretty much taking away the grain from ordinary farmers and starving them to death, those very farmers in the countryside who were being starved, who had their children taken away to the army, who were sometimes buried alive during that period, they themselves believed that Mao Zedong was a great man. And it's a very simple way of explaining that. People need hope. They believe that the man at the very top is benevolent.
They love their servitude, and once they buy into the con, they can never say they were wrong.
Indeed. It goes back to a very old traditional way of looking at things under the Chinese Empire. The emperor is benevolent, but his mandarins are crooked. The ones who carry out his orders are wicked.
Now, going back to his number 2, having his health care withheld, I had read that. I mean, that shows that in these tyrannical systems, whatever permutation they take, that it is the people that work for the system, statistically, from my, grazing over wide spectrums of history, that generally the most dangerous position, just like with Hitler, wiping out tens of thousands of his brown shirts that took him to power on the night of the long knives, that over and over again, it is the servants of the Dark Lord that are in the most danger.
That is true to a great extent. For instance, the Cultural Revolution is extremely complex, but essentially boils down to Communist Party members purging or killing off or torturing other Communist Party members. It's a great purge within the party. And that caused something like 2-3 million deaths. But of course, ultimately, ordinary people, the ones who died in the tens of millions, are exposed, have far less protection against violence that comes from above than people inside the party. But you are right, nobody would relish to be number 2 or number 3 in that kind of system. And Lin Biao is a very smart man who tried to stay away from it. But he too got pulled into it by Mao Zedong himself. And he tried to flee and, of course, died in tragic circumstances.
Well, Professor, we see this cycle over and over again throughout history, that when a aggressive group comes in, takes over, that almost always things get worse, not better. That's why 1776 was so special. They really did deliver on almost all of the promises, and it was, the greatest expression of a true leap forward for freedom. But if you look at the communists, if you look at the Nazis, if you look at the decline of Rome, and I'd like you to speak as a historian on this if you can, just overall, first they take over, kill off their first enemy, whoever was in power before. Then they wipe out the thugs that brought them to power, and there's always an escalation in the killing. Comparatively. And then you've got all these killers and psychopaths and sadists and control freaks. They've still got the bloodlust, the bloodthirsty enjoyment, and the paranoia that goes with it. And so then it just accelerates.
Yes, quite. I mean, these one-party states, whether it's under Stalin, under Hitler, under Mao, have very similar structures with similar effects. And I think Friedrich Hayek, the wonderful writer who wrote this book called The Road to Serfdom.
Yes, Road to Serfdom.
Well, Hayek saw it very clearly. Once you start stripping away every kind of freedom, the freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to trade, once you replace it by a one-party dictate, there can only be one road, and that's the road to serfdom, as he said rather clearly. I think the Great Leap Forward illustrates that better than anything else in 20th century history.
Well, Professor, I mean, you're obviously a very intelligent person. You've studied history. Are you not concerned about global parallels now with this global corporate elite who use collectivism at the national level to consolidate power, to then combine and move the nation's wealth into their corporate arms? I mean, globalization, when you really study what it's for, as the head of political science at Georgetown wrote, Bill Clinton's mentor, that this mega corporate elite, they'll fund fascists, communists, thugs. Our own CIA admits over and over again they'll choose a dictator over an elected government. And more we see the classical Western liberties, whether it's England or the United States, being dismantled Do you ever see parallels?
Well, what worries me more than anything else is the fact that we still have a one-party state in power in the People's Republic of China. It's very much the same party that committed all these atrocities some 50 years ago. Now, right now, the number of people who actually see China and the authoritarian state it represents as an example to be followed, I find that extremely worrying. And what I find even more worrying is what might happen if things go bad economically. What if that bubble bursts? What would happen with a People's Republic and a one-party state when things go downhill economically? That, to me, seems to be something we should be paying attention to.
I agree with you, Professor. We'll put your website up on screen. The title of the book, Mao's Great Famine, and Frank Dikotter is our guest. We've got a little bit of time left in this segment and the next. I've been asking a lot of the questions. What are some of the other big central points and discoveries that you make in the book? I haven't read it yet. I've just seen the reviews, but we do have a copy ordered.
Well, I think the sheer extent of the amount of documentation that comes out of the party archives, I find quite extraordinary. And I just wonder what happened during other periods under communist rule after 1949. When you start looking at 45 million people in 4 or 5 years' time, you just wonder what happened afterwards or in the decade prior to that. Most of all, I think that it is not just about trying to see Mao as the greatest mass murderer in human history, which of course he is, but also trying to treat the victims of it and try to, at least in respect to the memory of those many tens of millions who died, try to read about this event and treat it with the same degree of respect and knowledge as we treat victims of the Holocaust and victims of the Soviet Gulag. What I'm trying to say, I think, is that people simply don't have a choice or a voice in the People's Republic. There is no monument to the dead of the Great Leap Forward. There's no museum. There's no remembrance.
We have not publicly recognized, even in Western media, just how horrid this period was, and because it hasn't been called out, there's restaurants all over the U.S., college kids. I go back to that. And now, I remember, I've been on air 15 years. 15 years ago, our media would criticize China and its human rights abuses and its organ selling and the rest of it. Now, sir, I hardly ever hear that. That's why it was so refreshing to see you coming out and people looking at your research and a lot of media admitting, I mean, this seems like a big step forward towards really recognizing this evil.
Indeed. I mean, that's the tragedy of China becoming more powerful in world politics, is that there are fewer and fewer people actually prepared to look at what happened in the past, or for that matter, what is happening today.
And that same system's in place now. We've got 5 minutes on the other side, but recap and expand on the point you were just making, Professor, and then let's look forward. I mean, let's look at who they've got there. It's the children and grandchildren of the same totally wicked, inbred party elite, and now they own the majority of U.S. debt and have over 6,000 front companies here in the U.S. We'll be right back with the professor. Well, we'll definitely have him back up with us again because we haven't even scratched the surface. I hope you'll get the book, Mao's Great Famine, because it mirrors the separate research I've done, obviously not as in-depth or directly there at the source. This is confirmed, point of release from within their own annals. And as he said, it's only the surface, and it's so horrific. We have our own government lighting up the Empire States Building in the Communist Chinese colors. That's like lighting it up as a swastika. If we don't recognize that the same system is still there. My film, Endgame, Blueprint for Global Enslavement. You can get 4 copies to give to your friends and family of this seminal film for $19.95 for another 2 weeks. This documents our government's own admissions, major think tanks, the UN, saying they like what Mao did. Now, I read you a New York Times quote from David-Rockefeller. You see the young kids, I see them in UT wearing Mao and Stalin shirts. This is serious. This is serious, and we've got to stand up and recognize evil. So I hope folks get the film at Infowars.com because Sir, finishing up with that point about how we're the same groups that did this are still in control today. China owns most of the West debt. And where is China going now?
Well, it could. I'm not an expert on China today. And that's one of the troubling things, is that the so-called China experts seem always to be very willing to talk about every aspect of that country, whether it happened 1,000 years ago or what is going to happen in 10 years' time. So I'm very prudent with that. But looking at it, I think the real worry is whether there's another great leap forward taking place. Obviously, not tens of millions dying of hunger. But again, there's great faith by the Chinese government that it has somehow found a way to catapult its country past everybody else through some magic economic plan that has nothing in common with the rest of the world. This idea that they can somehow do their own thing in a very different way without having to pay respect to human beings, respect to freedom, the freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. That seems to me to be rather worrying. And in any event, it seems to me that if we really want to understand China now, you cannot but read up on its history of the past 50 years. These are, as you said, very much the same people in power, the same families in power.
The same people in power, the same families, becoming fabulously wealthy. I mean, generals making hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're killing the Falun Gong. They're killing peaceful groups. They're still oppressing Tibet. And our media more and more defends it.
Indeed. And the other query for China experts out there, of course, not for me as a historian, but would be to find out whether or not these methods are being exported to other countries.
Oh, they certainly are being exported to other countries. I mean, that's the issue that I see here. And then China's got so much influence over our internal politics because they own our debt. That, I mean, that's the main reason that the State Department 2 years ago said they're not selling organs when China admits they're selling organs. So now our government's lying for them.
Well, there you go. So again, is it another great leap forwards? I'd be very prudent.
It's incredible. Well, Professor Dikotter, frank-dikotter.com is the website. I know you're in Rome right now. I'd like to, while we have you, call you and try to pick a time to interview you again as soon as possible, because I'd like to open the phones up to take calls. And so we're going to put you on hold, sir, and find a time to get you back on in the future, perhaps in studio when you're here in the United States. I hope folks get your book and, as you said, learn to recognize evil so it doesn't happen again. God bless you, sir.
Thank you.
There goes Professor Frank Dikotter. We'll be right back.